Mm, 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 mm. Mm, 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 mm. So I've been in ministry so I've been a pastor at the church that I'm at now for 15 years. And I've been in pastoral ministry, give or take, since 2002, 21 years. I got married in 2004, August 29th. And prior to being married, I remember people talking about this idea a lot. You know, whether it's soulmates or whatever it is, this idea. And after being married, I was married, and then 4 years after marriage, I became a pastor at the church that I'm at now called Solid Rock Church. Love this church greatly. I've been around a lot of pastors, been around a lot of couples, and have watched couples work through a lot of different things. And this topic comes up a lot. This topic is something that happens a lot, usually when people are in a relationship, a marriage that's challenging. And this question comes up a lot. It's not supposed to say dos, right? But this question is pretty significant, and it's one that I think people really believe a lot. Even in talking about Christians now, a lot of Christians will wonder, did I marry the wrong person? All right. Now, it's a rare occasion that people ask this question when they're at their wedding day at the altar. But after you get married and you experience some challenges in your marriage, and now maybe it's counseling, or maybe you're not getting counseling, but there is a period of significant challenge, right? You start to wonder, did I marry the wrong person? I have sat in front of many different couples and have had to wrestle with this question with them. Okay, so the question is, can you marry the wrong person? All right, now let me be clear on who I'm talking to first and foremost. I am of the Christian tradition, and so a lot of my counsel, a lot of what I do, I'm a pastor by trade, a rapper by night. A lot of what I do is from the lens of what it means to be a Christian, all right? So if you're not a Christian, I think some of the stuff that I'm going to share in this video could still be helpful for you, but this will largely be for those who are Christians processing this question, all right? Did I marry the wrong person? Or can you marry the wrong person? All right, in order to answer that question in a way that I think is most faithful to what the Bible teaches, at least, you have to start with one, what are we talking about by marriage, and what do you mean by wrong? All right. So let me just qualify this right now. When I'm speaking of and answering this question, did I marry the wrong person, or can you marry the wrong person? I'm not talking about the possibility of being forced into marriage in some way, shape, or form. There are parts of the world where there are arranged marriages, or people out of fear or whatever are forced into marriage. I'm not speaking to that issue. When I'm talking about marriage, I mean the typical way we understand marriage. Two people meet each other, they fall in love, and they get married. All right. Now you add a layer, these people, if they're two Christians, meet each other, fall in love, and they get married. Okay. So I'm not talking about forced marriage or some kind of marriage in that way. I'm talking about you fell in love and you got married. Can you marry the wrong person? Okay, so based on that perspective of marriage, you willingly get into a marital contract with another human being. Can you marry the wrong person? All right. Well, let's start with, what do we mean by wrong? All right. If you're of the Christian tradition, there is a wrong person that you can marry. All right. So let's be clear. From God's perspective, if you are a professing Christian living out your faith to honor the Lord, there is a wrong person you can marry. Now, the Bible from the Old Testament to the New, it may use different language, but essentially, the Bible, God was clear. He did not want the Israelites to marry outside of their ethnicity, right? He didn't want them to marry anyone from the other nations. We see in the scriptures multiple warnings from God to the Israelites in the Old Testament: do not marry the Amorites or the Philistines or these people because they will take you from their gods. And we know that happened. I mean, the whole reason why the kingdom of Israel got split into the northern and southern kingdom is because Solomon in 1 Kings 11, it says that he married a lot of foreign women and built altars to their God. Okay. So this theme of not marrying people who do not share your ethnicity and by that faith spreads over into the New Testament, where we get and we understand that the Bible has a category for a Christian being married to a non-Christian. You got 1 Corinthians 7 talks about that. 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6 talks about a wife being married to a husband who is not obeying the word, right? But most often, the Bible, the New Testament, is just as clear in many ways as the Old Testament, is that when it comes to marriage, you should marry someone who is a believer. You should marry someone. So you got passages like 2 Corinthians 6, right? Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness, right? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said. All right? So there is a sense where this verse and some other passages, we can take those and apply them to marriage. Even though this passage is broader than marriage, we can apply it to marriage. So if you marry a non-Christian, as a Christian, I think you could say you might have married the wrong person. Now, in the sovereignty of God and all his control of everything, none of us ever do anything outside of his ability to work it out for our good, right? So even if you did do that, but ideally, if we're talking about what wrong is, should marry a non-Christian. All right. Now, if you married a Christian, a professing Christian, can you marry the wrong person? Can you marry the wrong person? Okay. And this is what I've had to talk with a lot of couples about. Did you marry the wrong person? So here's what happens. And this is the way it works out. The law of attraction. Now, this might be not every single person. If you're watching this live or listening to it later, it might not pertain to you. But for the most part, for some reason, many of us marry our opposite, right? Most of us marry a person who is opposite in many ways. It's a rare, I can say in my life, and this doesn't mean everyone. I've married hundreds of people. I don't know. I've married a lot of people. I've been to a lot of weddings. I participated in a lot of these things. And I've never married anyone or seen people get married who they had everything in common. Now, maybe you have, and I'm not saying that never happens, but for the most part, the laws of attraction lead us to people who are opposite of us in many ways. And here's why. I think because Adam and Eve were different, right? They complemented each other. I think the opposites attract, even the world uses that terminology, opposites attract, right? Because we bring different things to each other to make us, to some degree, we grow from that. Or let's just use language more complete, right? We usually marry someone who is different from us, maybe not too different, but different enough that we're challenged in the way that we are. Different parenting styles growing up, different things, right? But what happens, here's what happens. When troubles happen, when you start to have conflict, you have conflict over, and people wish that their spouse was more like them. So you marry someone that is somewhat different than you, opposite of you, opposites attract. But when you get into conflict, Your conflicts are over the person not being more like you. This is very interesting, right? This is interesting. So let me just say this and I'm going to explain a little bit more what I mean. The underlying issue in the majority of conflicts that people have is that they don't do things the way that you would and you hate it. I sit in front of plenty of people and they're not you sometimes they argue over their differences not because oh we were attracted to these opposites but now they're infuriating them right now the opposites are offending you the differences you wish your spouse was more like me well I wish they would no one says well I wish they were more like me I wish they would think like me but underneath what you're offended at is that your spouse does not do things the way you would do them so I wish he would just think about this and take this off of my plate or do this or do this to do this, right? And this is where it becomes like, okay, people get hurt, they get offended, and they feel like I've married the wrong person, right? We're used to the things that were opposites that attracted us, or now the things that we hate that we're married to someone who's so different than us. This is how conflict works. So this is how the enemy works in conflict. The opposites, the attraction that drew you together that made you opposites, is now the base for why you're having conflict and difficulty. You wish your spouse were more like you. All right? That's the underlying issue. No one actually says that, but that's the underlying issue. So does this mean you married the wrong person? Not really. In most cases, people do not marry the wrong person. You marry the wrong perspective. In most cases, people do not marry the wrong person. You marry the wrong perspective. And let me explain what I mean. So there are two levels of marriage. We get married. There's supernatural and natural, all right? In the natural world, we get married to people that and again, this is marriage where you fall. We get married to people that we fall in love with. We want to spend the rest of our lives with this person. Even their differences and stuff, we think they're cute. We think all this stuff. We have that perspective. We want to be fulfilled. We want a life partner. We want needs being met. We want to do these things, right? And those are all good desires. Those are natural desires that almost everyone who gets married has. And this is why when people get divorced, they often get divorced because of irreconcilable differences, which means we can't reconcile how different we are, even though they may have gotten married knowing that these differences exist. But at some point, you start to want your perspective changes and you marry someone who's different than you, but then you want them to be more like you as time goes on. So here's what happens in the natural world. In the natural, our desires for marriage and the things that we want become more about us. We want our spouses to be more like us, to do things like us, to like the same shows, to do the same things, to think the same way, to be as administrative as us, to be as affectionate as us. We want our spouses to initiate and do the things that we would do. And that's how it works. That's kind of what happens. And then you get this perspective in the natural side that marriage really is about your spouse being more like you and your needs being met and you having that life partner. In and of itself, it's not bad to think that way or wrong. But then there's the supernatural understanding of marriage, where God says, okay, the goal, whether you're married or single, is to be more like me. God never, ever, ever, if he allows for marriage and children, he never intends for the marriage or the children to replace him, but those will be part of the means in which that married couple will grow to be more like him. Okay? In the supernatural world, God's desire for marriage is that the two become one flesh and their children, and you help each other be more like the Lord. So what does it mean to be more like the Lord, right? Well, it's the fruits of the Spirit, right? It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. It's brotherly affection, it's virtue, it's, all of these different fruits of the Spirit that the New Testament talks about. That's what God is after when we're married or single. But when we're married, God does not ignore our happiness and our desire, but he often thinks, and I think it's clear, that he allows the fruits of the Spirit to be more important. So, how does God help us to be patient and loving, right? In a supernatural way. Now, in the natural world, if people treat you nice, you're usually nice to them, right? Peter says, look, if you loan to people, and if you like people that like you back, even non-Christians do that. It's First Peter, right? Even non-Christians do the same thing. They loan to people and get back. They like people that like them. But he said, but that you can't do that, all right? Jesus said you got to love your enemies, right? Well, how do you become more like the Lord unless the people that you're with, to some degree, tempt you in ways that you have to act opposite of how you feel? This is where I think a lot of people get lost. A lot of the Christian life is responding beyond how we feel. So we respond patiently even though we're offended, right? We respond with forgiveness even though we're bitter. Now, some things take a process and take longer than others, but the reality is in the supernatural idea of marriage, to be more like Jesus, you cannot do that unless there is some degree of challenge to you so that you have to act in those ways. If you're never challenged to be patient or loving, then your patient or love is never really proven. I'm a firm believer that whenever you suffer, what rises to the surface is who you really are. So God, even though he loves people, he loves, when we get married, he's with it, but God does not let our marriages, we do not find our soulmates. We do not find our ultimate fulfillment. Our husbands will let us down. Our wives will let us down. Our children will offend us. And it's intentional because, one, not only are we still sinful, but God does not want our marriages to replace our marriage to him and our commitment to him. But he also uses the differences of our spouses to help us grow in the areas that we need to grow in the fruits of the Spirit. If my kids were not hard-headed, then my patience wouldn't be tested. And they're not always hard-headed, but sometimes. If my wife wasn't selfish, then my love wouldn't be tested. If I weren't lazy or judgmental, then my wife, all of these things happen for a reason in the supernatural world. And for marriage, this is what God's after. You still have to be like me, and the way you're going to be like me is through some trials, which is what James 1, verses 2 through 4 say. When you experience trials of various kinds, count it joy because God is teaching you how to be persevere, be steadfast, right? Marriage is no different. So what happens though in marriage is you marry the wrong perspective. We marry the natural perspective and not the supernatural. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some situations that two Christians are so offended and so that it doesn't work, and I get it that divorce happens. That's not what I'm saying, that there's never a reason, whether they commit adultery. I'm not saying there's never a reason for divorce. What I'm saying is we often are married to the wrong perspective. And this is how the enemy treats us. So let me give you an example. The partner problem. When I'm counseling people, I hear this hand over fist, right? And it's genuine, but people will say something like this. Well, I just feel like we're not partners. I don't have a partner. I want them to do this, they do this and they didn't do this. And I expect them to clean the whole kitchen, but they did the dishes. I expect them to help me, when this happens. And it's okay to have that, but they think I don't have a partner, right? They're not a partner to me. They don't, and they keep going, and the other, well, I don't feel like I have a partner either. And then when you start to examine, what do you mean by partner? What do you mean? I promise you, that in almost every situation where I'm saying, well, what do you mean by partner? What the person typically means is, I want my spouse to do things that the way I would do them, or that I exclusively like. And that's the definition of partner. And I see it happen all the time. Now, I'm not saying this is in every case, but this is what happens. I want a partner who basically thinks and acts like me in various situations. I was recently meeting with a couple, and I just said, listen, talking to the wife, I said, you have a partner. Your husband is here. He's a part of this counseling session. He's with you. He serves you. He provides for the family. He does a bunch of things, but he doesn't clean the kitchen the way you like, or he doesn't think about the all the stuff that your children have to do like the way you do. And you want him to think about these things and do and be proactive and do these things. And I said, but here's the problem. You don't do these things because you don't have a partner. You do them because that's the way you are. That's the way you are. And your partner does things based on who they are. And this is the part of the problem that happens. It's your partner is not the opposite of you per se. Your partner is the person that God created and is growing them in different ways. And often you're just not going to think about it the same. I've been married for almost 19 years. My wife, I used to think at one point my wife had an idol of the vacuum. I was like, you just want the house clean. If someone comes over and there's a crumb on the floor, you want to, and I would be like, look, I'm not cleaning up for these people. They've been to our house before, they know what's up. Right? It would be like we don't. I'm not a slob. If you walk in my house, it's not like trash everywhere. But I don't have the same standards as my wife. And you know what? I never will. I never will. And it's not because that's not the goal. My goal is to figure out how to serve my wife based on who she is and how to serve me based on who I am and how those two connect or how I grow in the Lord. So I have to be more loving. I have to be not be rude. I can't insist on my own way. I try to figure these things out. That's what the Lord is doing in marriage. You see, it's not that you marry the wrong person, it's that many of us marry the wrong perspective. We start off wanting, we come into it wanting a life partner, but then the definition of partner changes. We don't, rarely does someone, how do you know that the Lord is not using your spouse's sins to tempt you to be more like him? That's the reality. And so what happens is in counseling sessions, when I'm talking to people, I'm trying to help them realize that, okay, the perspective on what your partner is wrong, or the perspective on your marriage. Many of us want to be in love and to have the emotional connection carry us through everything, and that's just not how it works. That's the wrong perspective. We think about happiness, as people often said, happiness, not holiness, right? God is going to cause us to grow in the fruits of the Spirit. And oftentimes, we're going to have to do them when people aren't treating us in a way that makes it easy to do them. So our spouses will fail us. Our children will fail us and we'll fail them because we're not the Lord, but we're trying to do that. But God is using their failure to help us be more like him. How can you be more forgiving if you're never sinned against and have to apply forgiveness? You just won't, it won't do it. It'll just be like, I don't have to forgive. But you have to forgive when you've been hurt by someone, especially someone that's close to you. So, and oftentimes we've married the wrong perspective, not the wrong person. Now, I'm not saying there aren't times when that person needs to really grow and honor the Lord in the way they're acting, and that's what we do in counseling. But it's not what we think it is. Now, if you're a Christian, what happens is you have to remember this, and this is one thing that surprisingly many Christians seem to forget. There is a supernatural enemy that does not like that you're a Christian and does not want you to be married. So, on top of just the normal stresses of life, you and I, if you are a believer, are up against a supernatural enemy that is trying to get us to the point where we're so offended at our spouses that we get a divorce. And that does happen, but that's the reality. It's not just my spouse is lazy or my spouse is selfish. There's a lot going on here. And the enemy wants you to think that your spouse's sin means they don't really love you and they don't, and that's what happens. And I see this happen all the time. Let me tell you the enemy's strategy in conflict. So you could be doing good with your spouse and you get into a conflict, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, you know what? You just feel like this is fake. Like if you were really trying, you wouldn't have done this. As if growth in the Lord is we never sin in repeated ways again. That's not how it works. But the enemy wants us to think that if it's real, if it's genuine, that our spouses won't hurt us or won't sin against us. But that's ultimately impossible because we're still sinful people. But we get tricked into thinking that this shouldn't be happening. Christians get divorced more because they think that they shouldn't sin against each other because they're Christians, and they're so offended at each other when they do. And I'm not saying it's right or that this somehow justifies sinning against your spouse, but we act like we shouldn't sin against each other because we're Christians. And the reality is, no, Christians sin against each other. What makes us Christians, what's different than non Christians, is the conviction to forgive one another and to try not to offend our spouse in those ways again because we want to honor the Lord. But a lot of Christians are married to a perspective that somehow, because we're believers, we should all be on the same page, and they're just varying levels of maturity. Like if you have children, some of your children are more mature than others. It's the same in marriages. So the enemy's strategy is to make you think that conflict is fake growth. Like you're not really growing. They're not taking you seriously. They don't care about you because they wouldn't have done this. That's just not true. I think the Lord sometimes allows these things to happen, not because your spouse is selfish, but because he wants you to put on mercy and forgiveness or overlook offenses or whatever that looks like. And when both Christians have that perspective, like our job is to grow in our conviction to honor the Lord in the way we treat each other, that's when the enemy loses. But when your perspective is we need to grow in our love for each other and meeting each other's needs, you can try it, but you're never going to do it to someone's satisfaction. Now, non-Christians don't have the desire for the Lord, so they have a different goal in mind, and they should. But the Christian goal and the non-Christian goal for marriage are not the same. While I would love to be happy, right, forever after, right, I would love to be there. That's just not the case. I get hurt. I hurt my spouse. My children get hurt. They hurt us. Same goes for you. This is the world we live in, and God uses that to help us make us more like himself. So do you marry the wrong person? I don't think that's the issue. I think God brought you someone that you fell in love with that is now challenging that love. And your perspective is either going to be, well, he's not or she's not making me happy, and that's the goal. And if not, then it's irreconcilable differences. Or it's, I need to relate to my spouse from the conviction to honor the Lord. And that means that even if they don't acknowledge what I do, even if they don't see it, I'm still doing it because it honors the Lord, right? And this is what you get in 1 Peter 3. I'm going to end with this. Now, this isn't just, even though it's given to women, I think the same can apply to husbands. But here's what it says. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct, right? So here's Peter's point. Listen, still honor the Lord in the way you treat your spouses, even when they're mistreating you because they disobey the word. And he goes on to say that they may be won by your conduct. This is what we have to do in marriage. But when we get caught up in sort of the American view of marriage and romance and love and sex and all of that, we just get offended. My needs being met. Your needs will never be met in this life. Never. Not fully and not to your satisfaction. Your needs, let me repeat, will never be met in this life to your satisfaction. That is the wrong perspective. But you can grow in the grace that God provides, even though it's difficult, like he's saying here. Husbands can be won by the conviction to honor the Lord that their wives have, and vice versa. That's the real issue. So it's not about marrying. I bet you if I was counseling this girl, she'd be like, man, I think I married the wrong person. But here's God's perspective is, no, you didn't marry the wrong person. You married the wrong perspective. And it's tough. Don't get me wrong. It's not easy. It's easy to say. It's harder to do it. But there are times when our goal in marriage is not to be everything for our spouse or our children. Our goal in marriage is to be as much like the Lord as we can. And in that conviction, we serve and honor and love our spouses and our children. And that's the real issue. But what do I know? What do I know? I only been married for 19 years and been doing marriage counseling for almost 20. But I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not actually working on a book right now. What do I do? This is a reality. It's a challenge. Marriage is hard, but marriage is hard for a lot of reasons. But one of them is because we think our marriages are supposed to make us feel a certain way, or we think our spouses are to eventually become more like us. And it's just not reality. Oh man, if it were. But do you really want your spouse to be more like you? Like they would be. If my wife were more like me, it would be crazy, or it would just be not a good thing. So I'm glad that my wife is different, but those differences challenge me. They tempt me because I want what I want, and I'm not going to get it because she's not like me and she's not going to do it the way I want to do it. Now that doesn't mean you can't try to learn your spouse's love language and all of that. That's not what I'm saying. Do that if you can. But I'm gonna be honest with you. There are people sometimes that are too hurt and too offended to just try to do someone's love languages. I think the love languages is a great goal, but sometimes it's not a good starting place. Sometimes there's a lot of hurt that you got to work through. And when I meet with people, it ain't like, hey, what's their love language and just do that. Like the book says, no, it's they're hurt, they're hurting, they're offended, and they got to work through the sanctifying process of learning how to be more like the Lord and forgive and overlook offenses and serve. That's what a lot of it happens. Being hurt is not about them intentionally trying to sin against you. And sometimes they do, and don't get me wrong, they do. But from the supernatural perspective, it's learning how to imitate the Lord in the ways we relate to people. I mean, my goodness. If the Lord were offended at us as easily as we are offended at others, man, we would have no eternal hope. But what do I know? What do I know? Here's what I do know. Here's what I do know. Hit that like and subscribe button and stop playing with my emotions. Stop playing with me. There's principalities in this smoky. Hit that like button. All right, I appreciate y'all. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. All that and all that. Appreciate you. See you when I see you.